Well, a narrative that is officially out there is the Mahomes versus Brady of it all. Who is better, or maybe better yet, could Mahomes catch Brady might be the better way to phrase it. Can Mahomes, at some point, be the undisputed GOAT of the NFL? And of course, it's not fair to just have him and Brady in the mix. There's plenty of other quarterbacks who, have a right to the throne, and I think he would have to surpass them as well. But still, it's an interesting discussion. The main way I heard it talked about was, I saw this graphic. This was all over Twitter, which was the Brady and Mahomes at age 27, which in fairness is a bit misleading because Mahomes does have an extra year at age 27 than Brady did, so it's worth noting that. Neither one of them played their rookie year, but Brady was a year older when he was drafted. But still, okay, slightly misleading, but not really that misleading. It's still 5 seasons versus 4 seasons, just keeping that in mind. But the graphic does seem to, even with context, edge towards Mahomes. 2 MVPs to Brady's 0 MVPs. Brady did not win an MVP until his 7th year in the NFL. Also, 2 Pro Bowls to 5 Pro Bowls. Say what you want about Pro Bowls, but that's what they have there. 2 first-team All-Pros as well, to 0 favors Mahomes. The one category that Brady has the edge is he's won 3 Super Bowls to Mahomes' 2, and again, with 1 less year to do it as well. No doubt about it, the Patriots had a ton of success right when Brady took over. Now, you can look at the record, again, with the extra year, it makes it look like Mahomes was significantly better than Brady, but it's actually just, slightly better, but it is still slightly better win percentage-wise. And then obviously, passing touchdowns and passing yards are going to be heavily in Mahomes' favor, but it's also worth mentioning, I think 2 things are true. I think that, Brady wasn't leading the league in these categories his, early years either. Again, Brady kind of notoriously was a bit of a slow start, didn't have to do a lot during those Super Bowl runs, but when he had to do stuff, he was able to make it happen. And then sort of towards the end of his career is when he, his longevity and his consistency is kind of what made him so special. But that being said, I think, again, even with context, this stuff does favor to Mahomes. Even when you factor in, it was a different era. Obviously, the bulk stats are going to favor Mahomes. I mean, I bet Daniel Jones's passing touchdowns and passing yards look better than Brady's does here. But still, I think it's fair to say that Mahomes has gotten off to a better start than Brady, and I actually decided to make a graph to kind of chart how I feel about these 2 players. So here is the graph using the almighty MS Paint. This is not the scale or anything, but this is just a visual representation of how I feel about these 2 players at this point. So, Brady, his career kind of went like this, I think, in terms of his greatness. Now, he won Super Bowls early, so maybe it's not a perfect example, but this is kind of how I view it, where he was always very good. His greatness continued to rise, but the fact that he was able to continue to improve year after year and his longevity is what allowed him to just continue this meteoric rise to allow himself to be, considered the undisputed GOAT as it stands right now. This is where I would say Mahomes is. I think Mahomes definitely has gotten off to a hotter start than Brady did. 1 less ring, but the reality is, he clearly, I think, has shown more than Brady showed in his first 5 years, even if you say first 5 years, not first, until your first 27 years of life. So if Mahomes does that and continues this kind of trajectory, or even slightly below it maybe for the rest of his career, there's definitely a real shot to the throne he could have. And I do think it's possible to say that he is on track to maybe becoming the GOAT. I think that if he does this for his entire career, I mean, if he plays for 20 years, let's say, well then he would have 8 rings and 12 MVPs. Like, okay, in that point, he's probably the MVP, or probably the GOAT. That feels pretty obvious. However, this kind of reminds me of, how like after week 3 every year, there's a new player who's on pace to break the record for passing yards in a single season or touchdowns, stuff like every year that happens. Like in baseball, there's always one player who the first month of the season is on pace to break the single season record that way. It's easier to do this for 5 years than it is to do it for 20. And the reality is, we don't know if Mahomes is going to play for 20 years. I think a lot of people expect players to, they're going to be playing longer just because, you don't take as many hits now, but you still take some hits. And listen, baseball players don't play to 45, right? So, it still is, I think he'll play longer than maybe players used to, but 45 is still kind of crazy that Brady got to that point, and maybe he just won't have time to catch Brady. So, okay, what does he have to do then? Let's just talk about, and let's forget about how we personally feel. Let's try to take that out of the equation of who is the GOAT and who isn't. I've always said I think Brady is the GOAT, but I think I've always also maintained I don't think the gap is as big between him and the next guy than most other people do. I think that while I would consider him the greatest, I don't think it's clear and obvious, but I still do think he's the best. But for Mahomes, who wants to overtake him, well, what is the way that he could, basically just guarantee everyone says, you know what, yeah, you're the greatest? First, he could win 8 rings, which is, probably not going to happen, right? I guess technically it could happen, but the reality is, I think if you put Brady back in the NFL and, ran it all over again, he's not winning 7 rings again. So much has to go right. You have to be so good, and you also have to get things to go your way, like being in a good situation, which Mahomes is now, but will that maintain forever? It's hard to say. We don't know how many rings he's going to get. 8 seems very unlikely, because even if he just wins 7, if the other stuff isn't clearly in Mahomes' favor, then people will always say, well, Brady beat Mahomes twice in the playoffs. 2 of Brady's rings came at the hands of beating Mahomes, once in the conference championship game, another time in the Super Bowl. So here's how else he could do it. To me, if he does these 4 things, I think you could argue he would be the undisputed GOAT of the NFL. I think he has to break the passing touchdown record and passing yards record, which I assume he would. It's only going to get easier to throw for touchdowns and passing yards, but I still think that you have to have those 2 things, given that you're playing in an easier era. I think those are because Brady retires with those 2 records. I think Mahomes would have to retire with those 2 records. I think he needs to win 4 or 5 rings. So I think he needs to win, I really think he needs to win 5. I think 4 wouldn't be enough, because you would still sit there and say in that situation, well, Brady has 3 more rings than you. I think probably 5, but maybe you could argue 4 would still be enough. I think he has to win 6 MVPs, though. And you might be wondering, how did I come up with that number? But I do think that for him to overpass Brady in terms of just, again, the general public, I'm not talking about for me, I'm just saying how would people view it. I think if he has 5 MVPs, well, Peyton Manning also has 5 MVPs. People do not consider Peyton Manning to be the GOAT the way that they consider Tom Brady to be the GOAT. Now, part of it is because Manning, had 2 Super Bowl wins, and one of them he was kind of carried for the ride, so people kind of only viewed the 2006 one, and even in that year, he wasn't great in the playoffs, or great in the Super Bowl, I should say. Although going up against a very good defense, I think that kind of gets held against him a little bit. That he's had to play some tough defenses in Super Bowls, but granted, in the Super Bowl you tend to play tough defenses. So maybe you could argue if Mahomes has the Super Bowl history of success and playing well, which now he has a great Super Bowl under his belt, and he has great postseason success. He has, if he has 5 rings and 5 MVPs, that gets the discussion going. But I think 5 rings and 6 MVPs, I think people would say, yeah, he's probably the best in this situation. Having twice as many MVPs as Brady, I think that might give it to him. I think another maybe better way you could even look at it is if you weigh MVPs and rings the same, which feels like that kind of is how it works. 1 ring and 1 MVP kind of feels like it gets weighed the same. You look like Matt Ryan and Matt Stafford. Both are guys who Stafford has a ring, Ryan has an MVP. And you kind of look at both of those players and say, yeah, they're kind of in the same. I feel like people kind of view that as the same a little bit. Personally, I would say Matt Ryan was the better player, but I feel like the general public kind of views one of those things as kind of an equal in a sense. So for Mahomes, well, then then what you're chasing is 10, which feels a little bit easier. You need now 5 rings and 5 MVPs to tie Brady instead of 7 Super Bowls and really 8 Super Bowls, because that seems next to impossible. That might be a way that Mahomes can get into the GOAT conversation as maybe a LeBron to Tom Brady's Jordan in a sense, because again, the 7 rings feels very difficult. It just does. The reality is 6 MVPs feels incredibly difficult. It very much does. But I do think that, listen, there's going to be some people who always say 6 is greater than whatever you have. If you don't have 8 rings, you can't talk about it. But at the same time, who knows? There's more to it than just that. But at the same time, I kind of feel like, I don't know, there's been this pushback on rings shouldn't matter. It's kind of fun when they do, though. Kind of makes football more fun when rings matter. I noticed maybe I mean, why shouldn't that be the way we look at it? Sports are all about entertainment at the end of the day. What's wrong with putting too much value on a ring? We're talking about greatness here. We're not making an objective test on who was the best player. We're talking about who was the greatest player. I think those are two different things. So for me, I do think that the general public would start to side with Mahomes. I think they're going to start to side with Mahomes regardless at a certain point. I think that if he wins a third or fourth, I think if he wins 4, he's already going to, there's going to be a chunk that always says that he's the best. I think the only way for him to really make it clear is if he wins 8. But I also think that if he can win maybe a 6th MVP and then 4 or 5 rings, that'll make it maybe like a 50-50. Some people say this, some people say that. But the question was not what can Mahomes do to be considered the GOAT. The question was, will Mahomes eventually overtake Brady and become the GOAT? And listen, if you're asking me if any player is going to win 5 Super Bowls and 6 MVPs, my answer is just always going to be no, because that's never even come close to happening before. But if you make me have to guess on who could potentially pull it off, the guy I'm picking right now is Patrick Mahomes. So we'll see what he does for the rest of his career. It's going to be a conversation that we might be having this decades from now, so it should be fun. Strap in. This conversation isn't going anywhere. But yeah, those are my thoughts on it. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.